There is a word that appears 74 times in the Hebrew Bible, and not one scholar alive can tell you with certainty what it means. It appears in 39 of the Psalms, 3 times in the book of Habakkuk, and then vanishes without a trace. It has no cognate in any neighboring language. It has no clear root in Hebrew, and yet 2 billion Christians have read past it, sung it, heard it explained from pulpits, and accepted explanations that are, in every case, guesses dressed up as scholarship. The word is Selah, and the most widely repeated definition, that it means pause and reflect, is almost certainly wrong. The trouble is that almost nobody knows what the right answer is either, which means the most common word in the Psalter that most readers cannot define is also the word that has been most consistently flattened into a footnote, and the footnote has cost the Church something it does not know it lost. The standard explanation comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where the translators rendered Selah with the word diapsalma, which means an instrumental interlude or a musical pause. That is the origin of the pause and reflect tradition, and it has been repeated so often that it now functions as a fact in the popular imagination. But the Septuagint translators were working 3 centuries after the Psalms were written, in a different language, under a different cultural and liturgical framework, and they admitted that they did not know what the word meant. Their translation was a guess. It was an educated guess, to be sure, but it was a guess nonetheless, and it has been repeated for 2,000 years as if it were inspired. The problem is that the internal evidence of the Psalms themselves does not support the musical pause theory. Selah appears in places that make no sense for a pause. It appears after a declaration of judgment. It appears in the middle of a sentence. It appears in Habakkuk sandwiched between 2 verses that are grammatically and thematically continuous, as if a pause would fracture the flow rather than enhance it. The musical theory fails on the very text it claims to explain. What makes this more than an academic curiosity is that the word Selah appears in some of the most theologically dense passages in the entire Psalter. It appears at the climax of Psalm 46, after the declaration that God is our refuge and strength, and then again after the line about the river whose streams make glad the city of God, and then a 3rd time after the command to be still and know that He is God. 3 times in that single psalm, the reader encounters a word that nobody can define, and each time it lands at the precise moment when the psalm is pressing hardest on the soul. That cannot be accidental. The structure of the Psalms is not random. The placement of Selah is deliberate, and if the word was important enough to be woven into the fabric of inspired poetry at the most critical junctures, then the fact that we have no idea what it means is not a trivial gap in our knowledge. It is a gap in our encounter with the text. There is a figure in the history of biblical scholarship who understood this better than most, and his story is worth pausing over. His name was John Calvin, and he wrote his commentary on the Psalms from his study in Geneva, a refugee from France, a man who had been forced to flee for his life and who found in the Psalms a companion for exile. Calvin wrestled with Selah for pages. He did not simply repeat the Septuagint. He noted that the word appears in contexts that do not fit a musical interlude, and he proposed instead that Selah functions as a kind of elevation or lifting up, a call to the soul to rise from the immediate circumstances to the God who governs them. Calvin was not certain. He admitted his uncertainty, but he was certain that the word was doing something, and he refused to let it become a dead letter. That refusal is itself a lesson. Calvin knew that a word that appears 74 times in the most prayed book of the Bible cannot be a stage direction. It has to be part of the prayer. The Hebrew root most frequently proposed for Selah is SLLI, which means to lift up, to raise, to exalt. It appears in the Psalms themselves in contexts where the verb means to cast up a highway or to lift up a voice. There is a related noun, sulam, which means a ladder or a stairway, and that word appears in Genesis 28 in the story of Jacob's dream, the ladder set up on the earth whose top reached to heaven. The connection is tantalizing. If Selah is built on the same root as the ladder in Jacob's dream, then the word carries within it the image of ascent, of connection between earth and heaven, of a pathway that opens where there was none before. That is not a pause. That is a portal. And if that is what Selah means, then every time the psalmist writes the word, he is not telling the musician to stop playing. He is telling the congregation to look up. Every person who has ever read a psalm and felt the text go flat at the Selah, who has skipped over it, ignored it, accepted the footnote and moved on, has been trained to treat a threshold as a speed bump. The psalms were not written to be skimmed, they were written to be prayed, and the Selah was placed at the precise points where the prayer was supposed to stop being a recitation and start being an encounter. That is not a minor distinction. That is the difference between reading about a fire and standing in the heat of it. The Church has inherited a psalter that was designed to produce a specific kind of spiritual experience, and the mechanism that was built into the text to produce that experience has been explained away as a musical notation. The result is that millions of believers have read the Psalms without ever being stopped by the Selah, which means they have read the Psalms without ever being stopped at all. There is a detail in the book of Habakkuk that deepens the mystery and makes the musical theory even harder to sustain. Habakkuk is not a song, it is a prophetic dialogue, a back and forth between the prophet and God, and it ends with a prayer that reads like a psalm but is unmistakably a prophecy. And at the end of that prayer, after the prophet declares that he will rejoice in the God of his salvation, even if the fig tree does not blossom and the fields yield no food, the text adds the word Selah. That placement is devastating to the musical theory because there is no evidence that Habakkuk was ever sung. The book is a written document, a prophetic complaint and response, and the Selah in Habakkuk 3 appears 3 times in a text that was almost certainly read aloud, not performed with instruments. If Selah were a musical direction, it would have no place in Habakkuk. But it is there, and its presence demands that we ask what the word was doing in a prophetic scroll that never saw a Levitical choir. The answer that begins to emerge is that Selah is not a function of the music. It is a function of the text itself. It belongs to the literary structure of Hebrew poetry, not to the performance of Hebrew worship. And once that shift is made, the word begins to make a different kind of sense. The Selah appears at the seams of the psalm, at the transitions between stanzas, at the pivot points where the psalmist moves from complaint to trust, from lament to praise, from memory to hope. It is a structural marker, but it is not a pause. It is a hinge, and a hinge does not stop the movement. A hinge allows the door to swing open into a new room. The Selah marks the moment when the psalm is about to turn, and the reader is supposed to turn with it. That is the first layer of the mystery, and it is already more than most believers have ever been told. But there is a deeper layer, and it involves a word that appears in the New Testament in a context that almost nobody has connected to the Psalms. The Greek word alleluia is a transliteration of the Hebrew hallelujah, which means praise the Lord. It appears in the book of Revelation, in the heavenly worship scenes, and it is the closest thing the New Testament has to a Selah, a word that is not translated but carried over, a liturgical cry that transcends language. But there is another word in the Greek New Testament that functions in a similar way, and it appears in the Gospels at the moment of Jesus' death. The word is tetelestai, and it is the Greek verb that means it is finished. Jesus cries it from the cross, and then he gives up his spirit. That word is not a Selah, but it occupies the same structural position. It is the hinge on which the entire story turns. And if the Selah in the Psalms was designed to mark the moment when the worshipper is supposed to stop and encounter the living God, then the cross is the ultimate Selah, the moment when God himself stopped, and the work that every psalm had pointed toward was finally, permanently, irreversibly done. But that connection cannot be made yet. It requires a deeper understanding of what the Selah was actually doing in the Psalms, and that understanding requires that we go back to the text and look at the word in its native habitat, not through the lens of 3,000-year-old guesses. The Selah in Psalm 46 appears after the declaration that God is in the midst of the city, and it shall not be moved. It appears again after the line about the nations raging and the kingdoms tottering, and it appears a third time after the command to be still and know. 3 times the reader is confronted with a word that demands something, not a pause in the music, but a pause in the soul. And the question that haunts every reading of that psalm is the same question that haunts every reading of every psalm that contains the word what are we supposed to do when we reach it? That question, what are we supposed to do when we reach it, cannot be answered by looking at the word in isolation. It can only be answered by looking at where the word sits and what happens in the text around it. And when you do that, a pattern emerges that is so consistent it looks like design. The Selah almost never appears at the beginning of a psalm. It appears after something has been said, after a declaration has been made, after a truth has been stated that is too large to simply move past. In Psalm 3, David cries out that the Lord is his shield and his glory and the lifter of his head, and then the word appears. In Psalm 24, after the declaration that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the word appears. In Psalm 46, as already noted, it appears after each major stanza at the exact points where the congregation is supposed to stop reciting and start receiving. The pattern is not accidental. The Selah is a liturgical mechanism designed to force an encounter. It is the psalmist saying, "Stop here. Do not read the next line until you have felt the weight of the line you just read." The Hebrew word that captures what is happening here is amad, which means to stand still, to stop moving, to take a position and hold it. It appears in Exodus 14 when Moses tells the people to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. It appears in Joshua when the sun stands still over Gibeon. It appears throughout the Psalms as a posture of waiting, of expectation, of being positioned before God without rushing toward the next thing. The Selah is the amad of the soul. It is the command to stop the forward motion of the mind and simply stand in the presence of what has just been declared. And that is precisely what the church has lost. The modern believer reads the Psalms the way they read everything else. Forward, fast, looking for information, moving toward the end. The Psalms were not written to be read that way. They were written to be prayed, and prayer is not a movement through information. Prayer is a standing still in the presence of a person. There is an early Christian document that sheds light on this practice, and it comes from a place and a moment that most people have never considered. The Didache, a manual for Christian instruction written sometime in the late 1st or early 2nd century, contains instructions for how the community is to pray the Psalms. It does not mention the Selah by name, but it describes a rhythm of reading and silence, of declaration and response, that mirrors exactly what the Selah was designed to produce. The community would read a line, pause, let the line settle, and then respond with a prayer or a silence before moving to the next line. The document was likely written in Syria or Palestine, in communities that still had living memory of the apostolic era, and it assumes that the Psalms are not to be rushed through. The assumption is that the Psalms are too dense, too heavy, too saturated with the presence of God to be consumed the way one consumes a letter or a history. The Psalms require a different pace, and the Selah was the built-in mechanism for enforcing that pace. Every person who has ever prayed through a psalm and felt the urge to slow down, to repeat a line, to sit with a phrase and let it work, that person has encountered the ghost of the Selah without knowing its name. The instinct is not the product of a personality type or a devotional style. It is the residue of a structure that was built into the text itself. And the fact that most believers do not know that the structure exists means they are fighting against the grain of the text without realizing it. They are trying to read the Psalms the way they read the newspaper, and the Psalms were never designed to be read that way. The Selah was the guardrail that kept the reader from moving too fast. Remove the guardrail, and the reader speeds past the very moments where the encounter was supposed to happen. Now the question becomes more urgent. If the Selah is not a musical pause but a theological command to stop and encounter, then what exactly is the encounter supposed to produce? The answer is found in the Psalms themselves, in the content that surrounds each Selah. In Psalm 46, the Selah appears after the declaration that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The encounter is supposed to produce trust. In Psalm 24, the Selah appears after the declaration that the earth is the Lord's, and the encounter is supposed to produce awe. In Psalm 32, the Selah appears after the declaration that the Lord is a hiding place who preserves from trouble, and the encounter is supposed to produce gratitude. Each Selah is tailored to the content that precedes it. The word does not have a single meaning that can be translated into English. It has a function that can only be experienced. The Selah is not a word you define, it is a word you obey. This is where the shadow and substance pattern begins to emerge, and it must be traced on the specific details rather than stated as a principle. The Selah commands a stopping, a standing still, a refusal to move forward until the reality of what has been declared has taken hold. Now consider the seventh day in Genesis. God finishes his work, and he stops. The Hebrew word is Shabbat, and it is the root from which the Sabbath derives its name. God does not stop because he is tired. He stops because the work is complete. And then he commands his people to stop with him, to enter into his rest, to cease from their labor, and simply be present with the God who has finished what they could not finish. The Selah in the Psalms is doing the same thing on a smaller scale. It is a micro-Sabbath, a command to stop the labor of reading and enter the rest of receiving. Every Selah is an invitation to stop working and start trusting. Every Selah is a miniature Sabbath, and every Sabbath was always pointing toward a rest that would not be interrupted. The substance of that shadow is found in the Gospel of John, in a Greek word that Jesus speaks from the cross. The word is tetelestai, and it is the perfect passive indicative of the verb teleo, which means to complete, to finish, to bring to an end. The perfect tense means the action is complete, and the results continue into the present. Jesus is not saying, "I am finishing." He is saying, "It has been finished, and it remains finished." The work of atonement is done. The sacrifice is complete. The temple system that required endless repetition has been rendered obsolete by a single act that cannot be repeated because it does not need to be repeated. And then Jesus does something that the Gospels record with careful precision. He bows his head and gives up his spirit. He stops. The Creator who rested on the seventh day rests again, this time in the tomb, because the work of redemption is as complete as the work of creation. The Sabbath rest that the Selah was always pointing toward has arrived. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews understood this connection, even if he never used the word Selah. He writes in chapter 4 that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and that whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. The Greek word he uses is sabbatismos, and it means a Sabbath-keeping, a cessation from labor, an entering into the rest that God himself enjoys. The writer is not talking about a day of the week. He is talking about a state of being. He is talking about the condition of the soul that has stopped trying to earn what has already been given. And that is exactly what the Selah was designed to produce in the worshipper, a moment of cessation, a micro-foretaste of the rest that comes when the work is truly complete. The Selah was not a pause in the music. It was a door into the Sabbath. This is the point at which the application becomes unavoidable and must be stated not as an exhortation, but as a consequence. Every believer who has ever struggled with anxiety about their standing before God, who has wondered if they are doing enough, who has felt the pressure to perform and produce and earn, that believer is living in a state of permanent Selah violation. They are refusing to stop. They are refusing to enter the rest that has already been accomplished. The Selah in the Psalms was a command to stop reading and start trusting. The Sabbath was a command to stop working and start resting. The cross was the declaration that the work is finished and the rest is available. And yet millions of Christians live as if the Selah has not been written, as if the Sabbath has not been given, as if the cross has not been accomplished. They read the Psalms for information and miss the encounter. They observe the Lord's Day as a duty and miss the rest. They affirm the finished work of Christ with their lips and contradict it with their striving. There is one more Hebrew word that must be examined, and it appears in a single psalm that contains more Selahs than any other. Psalm 89 is a messianic psalm, a meditation on the Davidic covenant, and it contains the word Selah no fewer than 4 times. The word in question is chesed, and it appears repeatedly in this psalm. Chesed is usually translated as loving kindness or steadfast love, but it means something more specific. It means covenant loyalty, the faithfulness of God to his promises even when the human partner has been unfaithful. The psalmist is wrestling with the apparent failure of the covenant. David's throne seems empty. The promises seem broken. And at each point of tension, the word Selah appears. The psalmist is being commanded to stop, to stand still, to trust the chesed oars of God, even when the evidence seems to contradict it. The Selah is not a pause, it is a posture. It is the posture of faith in the face of apparent contradiction, the decision to stop demanding explanations and start trusting the character of the one who made the promise. The final Selah in the Hebrew Bible appears in Habakkuk 3, and it is the most theologically demanding Selah of them all. The prophet has just declared that he will rejoice in the Lord even if the fig tree does not blossom, and the fields yield no food, and the flocks are cut off from the fold. He has declared that he will take joy in the God of his salvation regardless of what his circumstances look like. And then the text adds the word Selah. The prophet is not pausing for effect. He is stopping because he has said something that cannot be read past. He has made a declaration of faith that requires a response, and the Selah is the space for that response to take shape. The congregation that hears this prayer is not supposed to move to the next line. They are supposed to stop and ask themselves whether they can say the same thing. Can they rejoice in God when the evidence of his goodness is absent? Can they trust his chesed when the covenant seems broken? The Selah forces the question, and the question cannot be answered with words. It can only be answered with the posture of the soul. That posture is what the church has lost, and the loss is not a small one. The Psalms were given to the people of God as a school of prayer, a training ground for the soul, and the Selah was the mechanism that forced the training to take. Without the Selah, the Psalms become information about God rather than encounter with God. Without the Selah, the worshipper moves through the text without ever being stopped by the text. Without the Selah, the Psalms are read the way any other book is read, and that is precisely the problem. The Psalms are not any other book. They are the prayer book of the people of God, and they were designed to produce something that information alone cannot produce. They were designed to produce worship, and worship requires a stop. The heaviest truth that this topic produces is not about a word. It is about what the word reveals about the God who inspired it. God placed a command in the middle of his prayer book that forces the reader to stop, to be still, to cease from the relentless forward motion of the mind and simply be present with him. That command is not an accident. It is a revelation of the character of God. He does not want to be consumed. He wants to be encountered. He does not want to be processed. He wants to be known. And the Selah is the space he carved into the text itself for that knowing to happen. The church has filled that space with definitions and footnotes and explanations, and in doing so has filled the very room that was left empty for the presence of God. The Selah is not a word to be translated. It is a silence to be kept. And the silence is not empty. It is the space where the voice of God speaks louder than any word ever could. The soul that learns to stop at the Selah has learned something that cannot be taught in any seminary and cannot be captured in any translation. The soul that learns to stop at the Selah has learned to meet God in the space between the words, and that is the only place where the Psalms were ever meant to be prayed.